From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom, which of course takes place right here in Chicago, where we invented the 40-hour week and where labor, all kinds of incredible things happened in the history of Chicago. And just yesterday, we topped all of that with a whole new invention, the 14-month year. If you work for the Chicago Public Schools, you're going to get 14 months of collection of taxes. Of course, what happens in that, that 10-month year afterward, well, that's somebody else's problem, because that's what we do the best. On today's show, a bit of a history lesson, largely from a few decades ago. Now, you've probably entertained this thought yourself, to get really serious here for a moment. Why is it 100 years after slavery that Black America still seems pretty far behind in educational achievement, employment, just in financial stability? African Americans consistently lag behind other ethnic and racial groups in America. And there are even varied assertions coming from our political leaders, even right here in Chicago, that the street violence and shootings that we're enduring are somehow due to a lack of values. Well, let's run a scenario, okay? Let's say your parents or grandparents were unhappy in Logan Square in, 1965, and they were able to scrape together a little down payment. They bought one of those new ranch houses in Niles for $39,000. And when they passed away in the 90s, they were able to hand you and your sister that house, now worth about $270K, and a couple of IRAs, maybe enough to get you and your sister started on some pretty fairly stable lives, despite all these economic downturns. Well, now let's adjust that scenario. You're Black and you're living in West Lawndale, and you too have worked pretty hard and saved a little bit of money, but there are no federal loan programs available for you because the banks and the government drew a red line around your neighborhood on a map. So the only way you can buy that little house on 61st Street was to buy it on contract from a seller. Now, you might make your payments for years, but you have no equity, and the owner, who, by the way, wasn't really the owner, but really a predatory real estate dealer who got the house by scaring its former white occupants out and picking the house up for a few $1,000s, that owner is now free to ladle all sorts of charges and fees on you and makes no repairs on the house. So if you make it through that whole contract sale, the chances are you're pretty much broke and the neighborhood's filled with foreclosed or low-value houses. So you spend all your money and you have nothing to show for it. That's our question for today. What happens when generations of a family cannot accumulate wealth and pass it on to their kids? Is there anything that can be done to turn that situation around? What about a form of reparations? Not for slavery, as if that weren't enough, but for the racist, predatory economic policies that were created not in distant history, but in most of our lifetimes, and validated by our own local and federal governments. Can we do something about that? Well, our conversation today is inspired by this piece, a rather striking piece in The Atlantic by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who called for the case for reparations. And here, to help us with our discussion today, if we haven't already had it, is my friend Salim Muwakkil. Very happy to have you back again, Salim.
I'm glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. This is a very important piece, and when I saw it, I immediately said we got to have Salim on the show and talk about this. And joining us for the first time, Hal Barron, who I'm really happy to have with us today. Hal was at one point Director of Policy for Harold Washington and Harold Washington administration, an attorney who has worked on many different cases and social movements in Chicago. You call yourself an activist. I think I once heard you call yourself a hustler.
Yes. It's good Chicago.
Because you're from Chicago. So this is kind of where I would really like to start, if we possibly can. There's obviously a 300-year history to deal with, but let's deal with a 50-year history, something that we can all sort of get our hands around. What happened and oh, by the way, I think it's just important to say that this is in The Atlantic. The piece really focuses on Chicago and
Very
people
much so.
who live in Chicago. You know about this.
Yes. Yeah, it focuses, Ta-Nehisi says he chose Chicago after reading a few monographs and treatments of how FHA loans were allotted to African Americans, and how Chicago was a specific and very dramatic case of how contract buying worked, how a lot of black homeowners were trapped into that system. And also Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, in which she does a chronicle of a lot of black migrants from the South who came to Chicago. And he saw Chicago as an exemplar of this situation in which African Americans were really disenfranchised economically and politically when they came to the North, and how that economic disenfranchisement created this kind of this situation of chronic poverty, concentration of poverty, and how many of these social pathologies develop in this sort of atmosphere of lack in many black communities. And he makes a very compelling case for that.
Yes, well, Mr. Coates is an excellent writer and really gets a powerful story across and takes the Chicago scene to make a case. I think it's not a new case. You can find the FHA stuff in a book that was written in the 1950s, a dissertation published by Rose Helper. Basic information is there. It became dramatic in the 1960s as the African American community organized to do something about it and forced it to a crisis level. One of the crises that resulted was in the 70s, the Contract Buyers League challenged the whole system, took it to court, and lost. Another
it took years, though, right?
6 years, yeah. Another challenge was with the Chicago Housing Authority for public housing, which a case I was involved in, Gautreaux went to court about the segregation in the Chicago Housing Authority and won. One lost, one won, but in terms of actual impact on people's lives, neither of them won.
Yes, right. That's right. Yeah.
I have to say that one of the things that some dots that I connected that I had not previously connected have to do with Social Security. We go back to 1935. Social Security probably considered to be one of the most revolutionary things in lifting all boats, except you find out that there were a few boats that weren't lifted because what was the number? Farm workers and domestics were excluded, which meant that 65% of African Americans were ineligible from day one. And in the South, it was somewhere around 75–80% of African Americans just simply couldn't get into the program. And the other thing is the GI Bill. I mean, we all hear about, and I'm 65. I mean, I am of that generation that really benefited from the GI Bill because our parents and the parents of the generation before were able to get into inexpensive housing. They were able to lift themselves up after the war. And as I mentioned earlier, all of that wealth has come down to generations past. African Americans, not so much. They weren't part of the GI Bill because of the redlining. They couldn't get the houses, so the mortgage wouldn't make any difference.
Absolutely, and many of the federal programs were the responsibility for allotting the benefits were granted to state agencies and local agencies, and many of them in the South were notoriously discriminatory.
Particularly for black farmers.
Particularly for black farmers,
They were
absolutely.
really cut out of it. But the whole thing is the New Deal politically was dependent on the one-party Democratic South. That was it. And the North followed the tradition. As we became a modern country, urban, industrial, basically at the turn of the 20th century, the Northern modernizers, whether they were business-oriented or popularly oriented or labor-oriented, they dealt the whole issue of modernization, took the question of African Americans and race out of it. And this is amazing in a country that only 50 years before, that's the same amount of time from the civil rights movement till today, race had caused the bloodiest war in our history and was resolved only by the mobilization of the African American community.
That's right.
And it was wiped out. So all of the intellectuals, be they conservative business people, be they radical working class people, or be they reforming middle class people, race was off the table in modernizing America.
It's amazing, that's an amazing fact, and it speaks to the kind of amnesia that this country has when it comes to racial issues. I mean, just obviously you can look at our monuments to the Holocaust Museum, various monuments to what happened to Native Americans, nothing at all that is devoted to chattel slavery, which is perhaps the most formative institution in this country's history. So there's an amazing amount of denial and an emotional investment in this denial. That's why there's so much reaction, negative reaction, whenever you bring up something like reparations or any notion of guilt for that period of history in white America. And one of the things that Ta-Nehisi does in this piece, which is, I think, very useful, is that he kind of flips the script a bit and takes it away from the slavery argument and focuses on these contemporary insults and injuries. And I think that helps make the case a lot more compelling. But the issue of enslavement is still a very, very important issue that we need to grapple with in this country.
But I happen to be a historian, and Salim's point on the issue of slavery is very important. But it's not only important in terms of its direct impact on African Americans, but it's important on the way it has shaped our whole government, our polity, and our culture. There's a wonderful book examining taxes in the early 19th century by a woman named Robin Einhorn. And it shows how the tax arguments that we have today were set up by the preferences given to the slave owners, kind of thing. So that what we have is, it has shaped our culture, our political operation, and it goes on today. We no longer talk about there being, pure racism. We have a Republican Party that had Herman Cain for a while was running as the lead candidate, as long as he championed the issues of advantage, etc. And we have transformed the rhetoric of race, but it underlies everything. And what we have to do is to figure out what are the strategies and the mobilizations that can take place to do something about it. How can you reinvigorate the African American community that was such a powerful force in the 1960s? It changed itself culturally, and made a last stand here under Mayor Washington, who had a broad strategy, but unfortunately two things, was in a political era dominated by President Reagan, and he didn't live long enough. But we have to look forward to a new strategy. And this is a question I have with formulating the strategy around reparations. I think that's the weakest piece in
his argument.
Yeah.
Well, but, the thing also, though, I think it's important, perhaps if we cast this strategy in the way I like to frame it as cultural capital. One of the things that I say that African Americans lack is cultural capital, because we've never had the opportunity to develop it, because we're always concerned with deflecting white supremacy or protecting ourselves against the onslaught of white supremacy. So we never had the opportunity to develop this kind of cultural perspective that encourages behavior, that encourages success, that promotes success. Like other cultures come, you hear a lot of people complain about other immigrant groups who come to this country and kind of leap over African Americans on their way to the American dream. They come with cultural capital. African Americans have never had that opportunity to develop it. And I think perhaps if we frame this reparations argument, including the notion that not only were African Americans restricted from accumulating economic capital and other kinds of capital, but also cultural capital, I think it would make a much more compelling case, because people will say, well, you know, it's their own fault. But you often hear this: black people are engaging in crime in disproportionate numbers, and that's why they're in prison disproportionately. Well, there's something to that. It's not entirely a question of a racist police state, although that's part of it. But also part of it is a lack of cultural capital in the black community. I think we have to be honest about that. But we also, I think, have to be honest as to where it derives, where it comes from, where was it cultivated, how has that lack been enabled by government policy, and I think that would help make the case for reparations a lot more persuasive.
What form would that take? That cultural capital reparation, what would that be?
Well, black people, when they've had the opportunity, they develop cultural capital very quickly. They accumulate it very quickly. You look at Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example, which they call Black Wall Street. You look at Rosewood in Florida. Many metropolitan areas around the country had very self-sufficient black communities. Even in Chicago was known. Bronzeville.
Even in Chicago. Chicago was the thing.
That's right.
Chicago in the 30s and the 40s was so vibrantly, the African-American community called Bronzeville. It's a wonderful, the great Caton and Drake's Black Metropolis, you know, and the black people called it Bronzeville, and in terms of being suppression, it was called the ghetto. But Bronzeville was an amazing culture thing. Theater, literature, arts, music, my God,
Certainly
gospel,
music,
urban blues, etc. This was a burgeoning area, and it carried over into the 60s even. And at the 60s, what happened that my fellow historians haven't recorded is what you saw was a cultural change, block by block, people seeing themselves in a different possibility, seeing how they could act together. And that was dissipated. Part of it by the way the government responded, and we can consider the civil rights program of Johnson's Great Society a reparations.
In a sense, it was.
And but it was designed.
His argument was certainly a pro-reparations argument when he talked about you know, putting black people at the beginning of the race who are hobbled and expecting them to run.
And because of the nature and the way race impregnates our whole culture, our polity, etc., it became disabled. The war on poverty essentially was non-productive kind of thing. It was reparations wasted.
And then there was the counter the movement that was opposed to the Great Society, which was a lot of people compared to the what happened after slavery, the Redeemers period in the South. That the Civil Rights Movement was truncated by that Southern strategy of the Republicans, the law and order attitude of many Republicans that focused on the civil rights movement as a form of disruption, as a form of social disruption, and it needed to be quieted. And so a lot of that reaction helped smother the activism that was going on at that time.
Well, and it wasn't only the Republicans.
No,
the
that's
Democrats in the 90s,
absolutely,
they triangulated to handle this kind of thing.
The great Bill Clinton, right?
That's right. And so our challenge is really not to try to relive the 20th century. Our challenge, I think, for mobilizing and strategy is to figure out how do we figure out the dynamics of the 21st century and deal with it. and focus, because we're in a very different world than the 20th century.
Well, do you think that a race-specific policy, as is kind of implicated by this reparations focus, do you think that would not be effective? It should be a wider focus.
Yeah, I think you need both of them, and I think Mayor Washington, I don't know if he said it in public, but I know how many times he counseled me, Hal, this is the way you do it, kind of thing, is you have to have both of it. Here was a man who mobilized his major base to win the mayorship of Chicago with, it's our time, it's our turn, it's our turn. At the same time, I know setting in all this, I handled the issues for the campaign, is that you're figuring out how do we add on somewhere between 15 and 20% of the white vote and whatever we could get of the small Latino vote. And you had to have something that both could invigorate and capacitate the black community and their rights, and have a broader appeal. And Harold was a master of that. And I've worked with
perhaps the last master of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
There have been very few after him who have managed to be able to combine and reconcile those two sometimes competing impulses. And one of the things that beleaguered Harold Washington in his last, in the beginning of his last term, was the black nationalist community in Chicago was a little bit upset with his fairness emphasis. They thought it should be our turn.
What is this fairer than fair
exactly,
nonsense? Right.
And but the one thing with Mayor Washington's campaign is that at the end, and this happened to have been on my plate, he had a school reform program, and that involved all segments of the community, but emphasized the initiative of a parent community council. And actually, we had the business people finally said, oh, we'll follow them because they have the best ideas, a kind of thing. And it was a chance of reinvigorating the community. And I remember the first, when Harold met with the Parent Community Council was only 2-3 weeks before he died. And there were tremendous possibilities there. The week he died, we had the Illinois Farm Bureau, the conservative, big farm dominated downstate people came in and wanted to discuss a deal on state taxes that we could get the funding that was needed for the Chicago schools and they could get what they needed. Can you imagine that?
This is almost unimaginable these days. Right?
This is why you have to talk to historians once in a while, why you have to talk to people who were there.
Well, this is activists and hustlers.
Right, activists,
now,
hustlers,
Hal Barron
historians.
was really there. He was in the midst of all of that policy making during the Harold Washington.
Well, I was not aware until I was just reading up a bunch of stuff about you, but that it was in your home that the whole Alice Palmer, Barack Obama thing happened, which again, for those of us who are political animals, that's sort of like the beginning of the Obama presidency in a weird sort of twisted way. And
a weird sort of twisted way.
But that's how he became a state senator ultimately, and came to the attention of the Democratic Party, and the rest is, history. So.
No, I think I think that a Marshall Plan orientation is the way to go. I really do. I don't think there's anything that could attack these comprehensive problems that we have that is anything less than this serious attack of resources, serious devotion of resources to deal with the
Well,
issue.
it's interesting you say this, because the one point that I wanted to make on the show today, and I hope I'm going to get to make it clearly now, is that we live in this age of austerity when all the voices are saying government is the problem, God bless you, Ronald Reagan, wherever you are. But yet, when you look back on the history of the last 50 to 75 years of this country, it was the government stepping in with things like the GI Bill, with things like Social Security, that have taken this country and moved it many, many levels higher than it could ever possibly have hoped to have been. The problem that we're discussing today is not the success of these programs, but the fact that the program left an entire chunk of people out. Right. And we're looking back now off the balcony 50 years later at this and saying, oh my God, look at this. And yet we have the nerve to say, what's wrong with those people?
That's right.
Why are those people running around with their, pants hanging around their butts, right? And that is directly tied to the fact that their grandparents weren't able to accumulate, or their great-grandparents or great-great, but let's just talk about in our lifetimes, their grandparents were not able to accumulate the capital that the white people a couple of blocks away were able to do. And that's where we're all at today. I benefited from my parents' accumulation of wealth. It wasn't that much, but it was some, and it helped me get my life fledged. And I can't imagine what it would be like to live in a community where that wealth just simply was swiped from them by a combination of predators and the government that helped them.
And that wealth, and that lack of wealth, that poverty has been compounded, just like the wealth has compounded.
Well, but I would also say that we cannot, here's the 21st century and the 20th century. The development of the social welfare state handled many issues that you've just laid out, Ken. It has reached a peak.
Yeah.
It's not going to solve new things. And as race has been transformed from the development of chattel slavery, plantation chattel slavery here, through the Civil War South, to Jim Crow, to urban racism, as we see in Ta-Nehisi's piece, it's very different. And our language changes also. I'm hoping I can finish before I get finished a book that I've worked on for decades, but I call the reconstruction of racist rhetoric. We're changing how we talk about it. And we now talk about it, black people are not slaves. We don't use the old race categories that I grew up with.
Even the N-word is frowned upon vigorously,
Right.
I think it kind of perversely.
But it's been translated to various kinds of pathologies, deficiencies, etc., and they are supposedly being handled on a non-racial basis. But we know the way it comes down most clearly with the criminal justice system. It is race-oriented, but we don't describe it in Darwinian racial terms anymore.
I hate to do this, but I have to cut us all off. We've done it again. We've blown through our 28 minutes.
So much more to say.
You think? There's a few more things to say. And I just have to, I'm going to take even, well, I can't do it. We're flat out of time. But all of this ties into Wells Fargo and Countrywide and all the rest of that. You have been watching Chicago Newsroom. We want to thank very much Hal Barron and Salim Muwakkil for being here today. We're running very late, as we often do. This is Chicago Newsroom. Watch us at this address. You can see us anytime you want. We'll see you next week with another show. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks very much. Bye.